millions of people are starting to realize something terrifying: they may never actually retire. Not because they failed, but because the economic system their parents trusted no longer works. And while most people kept chasing stocks, luxury, and bigger homes, some wealthy investors quietly started buying something far older: farmland. At first, this sounds almost outdated. Why farmland? Why not tech stocks? Why not crypto? Why not real estate in big cities? But this is where the story gets uncomfortable, because while most people were focused on building income, a quiet financial shift was already happening underneath them. In the United States alone, institutional investors and wealthy families have been steadily increasing farmland ownership over the last 2 decades, not for lifestyle, not for farming, but for control over something modern finance cannot print. Production. And that's where the retirement story begins to break. For decades, retirement followed a simple promise: work for 30 to 40 years, save consistently, invest in markets, and eventually, your money would replace your salary. That system worked in a very specific era, when housing was affordable, when wages grew with productivity, when pensions actually existed at scale. For example, in the 1980s, pensions covered a major portion of the workforce in developed economies like the US today. That number has dramatically declined as companies shifted risk from institutions to individuals. Meaning one thing: the responsibility of retirement has quietly moved from systems to people, and most people were never prepared for that shift because at the same time, the cost of living was moving in the opposite direction. Housing prices in many countries have risen far faster than income growth for decades. Healthcare costs continue to rise aggressively in old age, and inflation slowly reduces the value of long-term savings, not in a dramatic crash, but in silence. A $100,000 savings account doesn't disappear. It just buys less every year. That's the part most people underestimate. And this is where behavior starts to change. People don't feel safe saving anymore, so they start chasing returns, stocks, side businesses, crypto cycles, high-risk investments, not because they are greedy, but because saving alone stopped feeling like protection. And this psychological shift changes everything, because when people lose trust in financial stability, they start looking for assets that don't depend on financial stability. And that's where farmland enters again. Unlike most modern assets, farmland is not just a financial instrument. It is tied to something basic: human survival demand, food, and that single fact changes how it behaves across history. During inflation cycles, during wars, during currency instability, during financial crashes, food demand does not disappear. It only becomes more valuable. This is why farmland behaves differently from most assets. It is not driven purely by speculation. It is driven by necessity. But here's where the story gets deeper. Because farmland is not just an investment trend. It is a reflection of something much larger, a silent shift in how wealth is being defined. To understand this, you have to look at how retirement was originally structured. Retirement was never just a financial idea. It was a social agreement. Workers contribute their labor. Companies and governments provide long-term security in return. But that agreement has been weakening for decades. Pensions shifted to private retirement accounts. Job security became flexible contracts. Risk moved from institutions to individuals. And suddenly, every person became responsible for predicting their own future. That is a massive psychological burden, because humans are not good at long-term uncertainty. So they do what they always do under stress. They look for certainty somewhere else. And historically, certainty has always been tied to one thing: ownership of real production. Not speculation, not promises, not digital numbers. Real assets that produce something physical. This is where farmland becomes more than just land. It becomes a symbol of independence from unstable systems. But here is the part most people miss. Farmland is not suddenly becoming important. It never stopped being important. What changed is perception. For a long time, modern economies made people believe wealth was mostly about financial growth, bigger portfolios, higher returns, faster gains. But that model assumes something very fragile, that financial systems will always remain stable, enough to support paper wealth. And history repeatedly shows that is not guaranteed. When uncertainty rises, the definition of wealth quietly shifts. From how much you earn to what you control that still works when systems don't. This is why some of the wealthiest investors in the world have historically maintained exposure to land, agriculture, and essential resources, not because they expect collapse, but because they understand cycles, economic expansion, then correction, then restructuring. And in every cycle, one thing remains consistent: people still need essentials: food, water, energy. Everything else can pause, but survival demand continues. And this creates a strange contradiction in modern life. The world is more financially advanced than ever before, yet more people feel financially uncertain than ever before. You can earn more money today than previous generations and still feel closer to financial instability. That gap between income and security is what defines this era, and it is exactly why conversations around farmland keep increasing, not because everyone is becoming a farmer, but because people are unconsciously searching for something that feels stable again. Something that does not depend entirely on markets, or employers, or currency confidence. Now, we come back to the real question. How much farmland does it take to retire early? The uncomfortable truth is this: there is no universal number. Because retirement is no longer just a financial calculation. It is a dependency calculation. How much do you need so that your survival is no longer fully controlled by external systems? For some, that means diversified investments. For others, it means passive income assets. And for a smaller group, it means ownership of productive land. But the deeper insight is not about farmland at all. It is about what people are actually trying to escape. Most people think they want retirement, but what they really want is freedom from economic fear, freedom from uncertainty, freedom from dependence, freedom from systems they cannot control. And that changes everything. Because once you understand that, you realize retirement was never about stopping work. It was about stopping worry. And in a world where traditional safety nets are weakening, people are slowly rediscovering an old truth. Real wealth is not what looks valuable. It is what remains valuable when everything else becomes uncertain. And that is why farmland keeps returning to the conversation, not as a trend, but as a reminder that no matter how complex the financial world becomes, human survival still depends on very simple things. And maybe the future of retirement is not about escaping work at all. Maybe it is about finally owning something that lets you stop fearing it.